So I think what we're going to do is we will get started, and then people will just join as they come into the waiting room. So welcome everyone. My name is Mary Warner with the Morrison County Historical Society. This is the final event in our Exploring History and Culture in Central Minnesota February event series. This series is hosted by 4 Central Minnesota County Historical Societies, the Morrison, Benton, Sherburne, and Stearns Historical Societies. The series seeks to foster greater understanding and awareness of cultures that have been and continue to be part of Minnesota and its history. This year's programming is presented by the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, also known as HMML, which is based at St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota. In addition to the online Saturday programs from HMML curators, each partner site has been having an exhibit of manuscripts from HMML. Currently, we have 3 exhibits. One is at the Stearns History Museum until February 27th. And then exhibits are also at the Sherburne History Center in Becker and the Benton County Historical Society in Sauk Rapids until March 3rd. Exploring History and Culture in Central Minnesota Hill Museum and Manuscript Library event series is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Central Minnesota Arts Board, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, otherwise known as a legacy grant. So we thank our grant sponsors for this program. For today's program, we have Mary Otsby, Executive Director of the Benton County Historical Society, who is our co-host. She's having a bit of sound trouble. And so what we're going to do is have Grace Duxbury from the Morrison County Historical Society do our intro of today's speaker. Grace, go ahead.
All right, thanks, Mary. So today's program, Pekran, an encounter with Coptic cultural heritage, will give a brief introduction to the ancient and fascinating Coptic Egyptian culture. Coptic Christians represent a small but growing community in Minnesota with 2 churches in the Twin Cities area. The program will also highlight resources for the study of Coptic cultural heritage, focusing on manuscripts digitized by the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, also known as HMML, at St. John's University in Minnesota. Today's presentation is by Dr. David Calabro, curator of Eastern Christian manuscripts at HMML. There will be a Q&A section at the end, so please use the chat for your questions. Otherwise, I
was going to say, just the chat for those who don't know, if you move your mouse, you'll find a bunch of tools at the bottom, including participants, chat, and then also a live transcript. So go ahead and just click on those buttons as you need to, and you'll have with participants in chat, those will pop up on the side.
All right. Otherwise, I think without further ado, I will pass it off to Dr. Calabro.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you, Grace, for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And right. Okay, so to begin with, oh yeah, and also just reminded myself, thank you all for joining this morning on a Saturday morning. What a great thing to do to learn about different cultures. So to begin with, I want to take you back several years to 2002. And my wife and I were living at that time in Nashville, Tennessee. I was a graduate student at Vanderbilt University. And as we were on our way somewhere on the highway driving by, and I noticed this place called the Gold Star Market. And you know, there are a number of signs you look for a nice Middle Eastern market, and I was excited to find some place where I could get real authentic pita bread and other nice food from the Middle East. So I stopped, and my wife was with me at the time, and we went in, and so just, you know, there are signs that you look for, like you know, you notice crosses and icons and things by the register area. I realized that this is a Christian, owned by Christians. It's a Middle Eastern market owned by Christians. The Gold Star market is still there in the Nashville area. So we went in just talking to people. It was very easy to make some friends. And one of the people we met, her name is Eleanor. She invited us, or it's Ili Nur in Arabic is her name. And she invited us to her church, the Coptic church near there in Nashville. It was St. Mary's Coptic Church. And like many people, my wife and I knew that the Coptic church existed. My wife and I actually met in Jerusalem on a study abroad program. And so we were somewhat familiar with Middle Eastern cultures. But like many people also, we weren't all that deeply familiar with the Coptic church. So we learned a lot of things as we attended the church, the St. Mary's Church. And when we attended, it happened to be a celebration of the Feast of the Assumption of Mary. So it was a feast day, and it was interesting to kind of observe the liturgy. Coptic liturgy has a lot of distinctive elements. There's a lot of incense, and there's a procession around the interior of the nave. And so it was really a fun, neat experience. And so that was the beginning of our acquaintance with the Coptic community in Nashville. St. Mary's Church happened to have a Coptic school with about 5 little girls who would attend. It wasn't a girls' school, but it just so happened that the students at the time were all girls. And they were teaching the Coptic language, which Copts today, oh, I'm behind on the slides. I meant to advance the slide here. So here's the St. Mary's Coptic Orthodox Church in Nashville. On our visit there, we met Bishop Yusuf and Father Boutros, bishop and the priest in that area. And we met lots of other people as well. So over time, I started going to the Coptic school. I stood out like a sore thumb, I'm sure, both because of my age and because I had no idea about, I didn't know Coptic or I knew some Arabic at the time, but I wasn't a native speaker like the people there. So, but it was a neat experience. I was excited to learn about the language. This kind of propelled me into, this experience propelled me into my studies later at the University of Chicago, where I studied Egyptian language, including Coptic, and then eventually led to my current position as the curator of Eastern Christian manuscripts at the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, where I work not just with Coptic, but with Christian Arabic and Syriac manuscripts. And so the Coptic community is widespread in the United States. Many Egyptian Christians have come to live here, and even in the Twin Cities, there are 2 Coptic churches. It's a small community but growing. So there's the St. Mary's Coptic Orthodox Church in St. Paul, which was constructed, I think it was in 2014. No, I'm sorry. It was in 2000 that the St. Mary's Church was built or was established there. It was previously a Baptist church. And then in 2016, the St. George Coptic Orthodox Church was built in Plymouth. Okay. The Coptic community is Egyptian Christian and has very ancient roots in Egypt. Today, I think most people, when they think of Egypt, they consider it basically Islamic, which Islam is the predominant religion in Egypt. accounting for about 90% of the population today. 10% of the population, though, is Christian in Egypt, and of that 10%, about 9% are Coptic. So Coptic Christianity represents actually two churches today, the Coptic Orthodox Church and the Coptic Catholic Church. And one of the distinctive things about the Coptic Christian community is the Coptic language. Now, Coptic is, unlike Arabic, it's not a Semitic language, although it is related to the Semitic languages. And Coptic is actually the latest stage of the ancient Egyptian language of the pharaohs. So Coptic is, if you see it written, it doesn't look like Egyptian hieroglyphs because it's written with basically the Greek alphabet with a few added letters to represent sounds that did not exist in Greek. However, and there are also a lot of Greek loan words, but the basic underlying grammar is ancient Egyptian, and the majority of the vocabulary is ancient Egyptian. So in fact, a knowledge of Coptic is one of the things that enabled Jean-Francois Champollion to decipher the Egyptian language. So Champollion wrote in 1809, "I am totally immersed in Coptic. I want to know Egyptian as well as I know French, because my great work on the Egyptian papyrus will be based on this language. As for Coptic, I do nothing else. I dream in Coptic. I do nothing but that. I dream only in Coptic, in Egyptian." And in fact, if you study Coptic, it's really difficult not to dream in it. It's really, it's a beautiful language and very fun to work with. So to give you a sense of the ancient roots of Coptic, I want to show you. So this is how you say in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost in Coptic. So this is a formula you might see in the liturgical text. And most of the nouns in that phrase can be traced straight back to ancient Egyptian words that you can find in hieroglyphic inscriptions going back to the 3rd millennium BC. So it's a very enduring language, in fact. So you have pekran, which means the name, okay, and the pa definite article, the masculine definite article goes back to late Egyptian, so late Bronze Age. And then you have the word ran, name. So that goes way back into Old Egyptian hieroglyphs. And the word yot means father. And again, the word is attested in ancient Egyptian going all the way back. And then shiri, the word for son, goes back to an ancient Egyptian word for lad or younger son. And then you have this interesting word, pipneuma etwab, which means the Holy Spirit. And so part of that is Greek, the word pneuma, but then you have the word holy comes from an ancient Egyptian word that means pure. So that phrase in Coptic would be pronounced chen pran empiot nempeshiri nempi pneuma etwab. So you might be wondering about the title of this presentation, Ashpe Pekran. It's kind of intentionally mysterious, hoping people would join on to find out what that means. So you might be wondering what Ashpe Pekran means. That's actually how you say, "What is your name?" in Coptic. And this would be only if you're talking to one man, to a male person. You would say, Ashpe Pekran. Ash means what, pe is the copula, it translates roughly as is, and then pek is definite article the with the masculine second person pronoun, the k there is the pronoun, and then bran, name. So what is your name? If you're speaking to a woman, you would say ashpe peran, what is your name? And to answer that, if someone asks you, Ashpe Pekran or Ashpe Peran, you would say Paran Pe, and then your name. So I would say Paran Pe Dawid. My name is David. Then another useful phrase that I'm putting in here is how to say good feast or happy feast. And in Coptic, that would be Nofri Shai, good feast day. So this coming Monday, I believe, is the Feast of Great Lent. So if you meet a member of the Coptic community on Monday, you could say Nofri Shai, good feast. Okay. In Coptic, another thing is, so most Copts today do not speak Coptic as a first language. In fact, I don't know of any that do. All Copts that I know of speak Arabic as a first language. And if they understand Coptic, it's because they've studied it in school, and Coptic is still used in the liturgy of the Coptic Church and in some other contexts with brief phrases and such elsewhere, despite many attempts at kind of reviving the language and making it a first language, a living language today. But even in Arabic, there are some differences in the phrases that are used for greetings and other expressions between Coptic Arabic and Islamic Arabic. So for example, you may have heard this quite a bit, the phrase, Assalamu alaikum. This is how you say, this is one way of extending a greeting in Arabic for Muslims. Assalamu alaikum. It translates literally as peace be upon you, with the plural pronoun for you. Now, in a Coptic context, usually they would say not assalamu alaikum, but assalamu lak. If you're speaking to a man, again, literally peace be to you. And this is a direct translation of the ancient Coptic greeting, Sherenak, greetings to you. Okay. Now I want to switch into a really brief overview of the history of the Coptic community in Egypt. And I think this is important to understand, just to kind of give a sense of the antique roots of the community. And because with a community this ancient, the past is very present in many ways. The past is relevant in the present and becomes even an issue. It becomes a political issue. It becomes a matter of deep cultural importance. And now in this overview, I mentioned it's going to be very quick. We really don't have time today to go into great depth on these things. So I hope that this will at least give you some entry points into the history of the Coptic community. So the community is believed to have been founded by Saint Mark the Evangelist in the 1st century. So he's said to have entered Alexandria in 61 AD and preached the gospel there. There's a great story about how he met a cobbler, and as the cobbler was fixing Saint Mark's shoes, because Saint Mark's shoes were really worn down from all his traveling, the cobbler drove the awl through his finger by accident and made an exclamation, "Oh, the one God!" And then Saint Mark used that as kind of a way of teaching this cobbler about the Christian God. So, and then that cobbler ended up becoming the first bishop of Alexandria. So, so that's one of the stories about Saint Mark. And today, even this will how important this original event is. the patriarch or pope of the Coptic Orthodox Church is known as the Bishop of the See of St. Mark, or the Episcopal Seat of St. Mark. Okay, so we don't have a whole lot of evidence, especially textual evidence, for the Christian community in Egypt during the 1st and 2nd centuries. One of the few pieces of textual evidence we have for the 2nd century is Papyrus Rylands 457, which is thought to be the earliest surviving testimony to a canonical gospel from any manuscript. So this is circa 2nd century CE. It contains a part of John 18. And it's in Greek. So this shows a little bit about the linguistic environment there. Even though people, of course, in Egypt were speaking Egyptian, they were using Greek as a language for the religious literature, especially Jewish and Christian literature in Egypt was predominantly written in Greek, especially during the 1st and 2nd centuries. Now, alongside the use of Greek script for writing Greek, we have, even in these early centuries, the use of Greek script to write indigenous texts, native Egyptian texts in Egyptian. So this is an example. This is actually from the 4th century. This is the Great Paris Magical Papyrus, now held at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. And this represents what's known as Old Coptic. So this is not a Christian text. In fact, this papyrus is full of magical charms invoking not Christian saints or Jesus or Mary, but invoking ancient Egyptian and Jewish names of power, in fact. So interestingly, showing a blend of kind of using Jewish religion and indigenous Egyptian pagan religion kind of together. But what this shows is efforts to express native Egyptian language, native Egyptian texts using Greek script. And today it's thought that rather than Christianity being the impetus for the development of Coptic, what probably was the case is that using Greek script to write Egyptian began as an effort to preserve the texts and to show how they should be pronounced, because ancient Egyptian doesn't represent vowels. It just represents the consonants of the language. But this led eventually to the development of Coptic, which became the predominant way of expressing Christian texts in native Egyptian using Greek script. So by the 3rd century, we have this really interesting mix of Greek together with Coptic texts in the same collections of texts of books. So I list here a few of the more famous finds of papyri in Egypt from the 3rd century and onward. So the Chester Beatty papyri containing really important Greek manuscripts of biblical texts, and also apocrypha magical texts. The Oxyrhynchus papyri, a really interesting mix of all kinds of native Egyptian, Greek, and Christian material together. And we have the Nag Hammadi codices found in Upper Egypt. So these are predominantly Gnostic texts, and Gnostic Christianity is an interesting phenomenon that we see during the early centuries CE. It's, to read these Gnostic texts from the perspective of modern Christianity, it can be jarring, it can be shocking. There's a lot of very interesting doctrine in these texts, but it shows how Christianity was being kind of blended with native pagan elements. And then you have the Bodmer papyri, Greek and Coptic texts from the Bible, from early Christian literature, and also from classical Greek literature. And so during this period, you see more of a flowering of Coptic literature as it starts to appear more and more, and together with Greek. Also during the 3rd century, this was a time when it was not really safe to be a Christian in Egypt. There were intense persecutions. This was the time of the Emperor Diocletian near the end of the 3rd century, Roman emperor starting in 284. His persecutions of Christians were so intense that 284 became the starting point for the Coptic calendar. That's when Copts start counting the calendar for at least up until modern times, where texts are dated according to the year of the martyrs, the year of the ascension of Diocletian as Roman emperor. So on the left, you can see an image of Saint Damiana, a female saint, and the 40 virgins who were martyred under Diocletian, according to the story of that martyrdom. Then by the 4th century, we have a different thing happening, because the 4th century is when Christianity becomes effectively the official religion of the Roman Empire, starting with Constantine, the Emperor Constantine. And so during this period, we have, from what was more of a fragmented Christianity in the 3rd century, we have now more of a unified Christianity in Egypt in the 4th century. This is reflected not only in the distribution of texts, but also in the textual tradition itself. So we have not so many variants of biblical texts, but now kind of a standard text for the New Testament, represented by manuscripts like Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. During this period also, actually starting in the 3rd century, but really becoming a thing in the 4th century, we have the Desert Fathers. So this is a very important tradition of Coptic Christianity. Saint Anthony the Great is known as the father of Egyptian monasticism. So the tradition of going out into the desert to escape the world, not just to escape, but to find enlightenment, to get closeness to God, to get closer to God, and to increase one's spirituality, which is meant ultimately to benefit society, to help the world in general. And so you have at this time the development of a tradition of monastic asceticism and monastic communities growing up in monasteries all over Egypt. So a very strong tradition of monasticism, going back, usually traced to Anthony the Great. Here's another important monk and very important figure in literature in Coptic Christianity, Saint Shenouda of Atripe, who lived during the 4th century and into the 5th century. He had a very long life, if you believe the texts about him. And he founded the White Monastery near Sohag, Egypt. Today, the White Monastery doesn't look exactly like you see in the picture. It suffered some damage actually very recently. But this is an older picture showing the White Monastery and Saint Shenouda. Saint Shenouda is also famous for really making Coptic literature a very vibrant literary medium for writing theology in beautiful prose. Okay, an important event happened in the 7th century in Egypt. This is when Amr ibn al-As, the general under the Rashidun caliphs in Islam, conquered Egypt. This is generally placed, it happened around this time, but 641 CE is the precise date that's usually given for the conquest of Egypt. Amr also established the modern city of Cairo. And this was an important event for many reasons. One is that it started the trend, which eventually made Arabic the predominant language of Egypt. So in the picture below, you can see a documentary text from the 8th century written in Arabic on papyrus. So Arabic gradually became the predominant language of doing business and of literature and of all kinds of expression in Egypt as a result of the Islamic presence there. So I'm jumping around here, sensitive to the fact we don't have forever to do this. I wish we did, but by the 10th and 11th century, you get an important shift. So up until this time, Coptic, and specifically Sahidic Coptic, the dialect of Upper Egypt, was the predominant language of Christian expression, of theological writing. After this time, after the 10th and 11th centuries, you get a shift where now Arabic is the predominant language of writing. And when Coptic is written, now the main medium for Coptic is a different dialect known as the Bohairic dialect, which is the dialect of Lower Egypt. And the monastery of Wadi Natrun, you can see this on the left side near the top of the map here. Wadi Natrun, ancient Scatus, became an important center for the production of manuscripts in Bohairic Coptic. So this was also a center where a lot of Arabic texts of Christian meaning were produced. Here's an example from the medieval period of a book written in Bohairic Coptic. So this is actually a gospel book. Here we see the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. And notice the beautiful illumination on the page. This was I took this picture. It's a really hard picture to take because there was a light shining down on the glass, but in a way that's kind of nice because it shows you can see the reflection on the gold on the page, which really this is indicative of the rich production of manuscripts, of books during this period, very fine work, and also showing interesting links with the contemporary Islamic book production in the Ayyubid and Mamluk periods. This kind of decoration, you can find Qurans that are very similar in the geometric motifs, the illumination, and the colors that are used to manuscripts produced during this period in the Coptic community. So this is going to segue into the Coptic Church in modern times. These are a couple of pictures from the Church of Sergius and Bacchus in Cairo, in the main old city of Cairo. It's a very ancient church going back to the 4th century. And in fact, this site marks also a very important place in Coptic Christianity, the place where the Holy Family rested on its way into Egypt. And so there's a kind of, you descend a flight of stairs into this area that marks the site where the Holy Family rested. It's underneath the Church of Sergius and Bacchus. This was also an important medieval church during this period. After the 11th century, this part of Cairo, the Church of Sergius and Bacchus, and also the Church of the Hanging Church in Cairo, were kind of in competition with one another as a seat of the Coptic Patriarch. And on the right, you can see, I love this picture because in this church, there's this little library of manuscripts. And it's a beautiful, neat place. And also it just makes, for someone like me that really likes ancient books, you just stand there and stare and you're like, wow, this is a really amazing place. But also, I love the pose of this man as he's looking at these manuscripts. For Coptic Christians, the culture of the book, and especially old books in Coptic, are very significant culturally, and the preservation of these books is important to the community, right? These aren't just things that you throw away. These are things that are revered and important in the culture. So another thing that's important today is the Coptic language. Even though most Copts don't speak it as a first language, there have been attempts over the years to revive the language. And so here you see a book oriented to teaching Coptic and a very nice poem about Coptic published in 1969. I am a little boy, I know my language, and since my early age, my mother speaks it with me. Okay, and then at the end, the language of our fathers is your real language. Learn it, for it is necessary to speak it at home. So there's a lot wrapped up in that poem, but it definitely shows the importance of the language in Coptic Christianity and the reverence in which it's held. Okay, the Coptic Church is very vibrant today. On the left is a picture of the current Coptic Pope, Tawadros II. And on the right, you can see this is a place I visited just this year, Hani Takla at the Saint Shenouda, the Archimandrite Coptic Society, named after that same Saint Shenouda that we saw the picture of earlier in Los Angeles. And this is a place where Mr. Takla has done, Professor Takla, I should say, has done great work in gathering Coptic manuscripts in this really interesting museum. And there's a study center there, a beautiful place where Coptic Christianity is studied. I also want to mention, so that with the Coptic community in the United States has been growing ever since the 1940s. And today it's estimated that there are, well, this was actually in 2018, so a little bit old already, but there were about 500,000 Copts living in the United States. And and you can see from even in the Twin Cities, this is indicative of the growth of the Coptic community. There are, as I mentioned, 2 churches in the Twin Cities, really important centers of Coptic communities in the United States today are New York, New Jersey, Southern California, and now Nashville is growing a lot as well. I want to talk a little bit about the work of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library in preserving Coptic heritage. So these pictures are taken from Wadi Natrun, that site that we mentioned earlier. In the picture on the left, the person second from the left is Father Columba, Executive Director of HMML. And on his right, or the stage, our left in the picture is Father Wadid, and on the right of Father Columba is Anba Epiphanius, unfortunately now deceased. He was tragically murdered some years ago. But this shows Father Columba with some of the monks of the monastery, and on the right you can see the digitization going on with the manuscripts that they have there. So HMML is now promoting the digitization, which is being done by people at the monastery, of the collection there, the collection of the St. Macarius Monastery in Wadi Natrun. Right now, if you get onto VHML, I'll show you that in a minute. you can access 74 manuscripts from this collection, and they're still coming in. Okay, really briefly, because I know our time is short, I want to show you some of the resources that you can access at HMML to study Coptic Christianity and Coptic manuscripts in particular. This is a papyrus fragment actually owned by HMML, so we have this one on site, dating to about the 5th century, containing what appears to be a letter in Coptic. This is a Coptic Psalter fragment showing parts of, you can see Psalms 26 and 27 with the headers on the left. This is from the 9th century, and it's written not on papyrus, but on parchment. Okay, so this is an important transition in the book culture of Egypt that happened about the 4th century. You get more books now written on parchment. Okay, and this is rather large, actually. To picture this, you'd have to see it in person. It's over 31 by 24 centimeters. This is something you occasionally find in manuscripts, where pieces of older manuscripts are used to support the binding in a newer manuscript. So, and sometimes these older fragments can be very significant. So here, this is from a Syriac book that comes from Jerusalem, actually, or was digitized in Jerusalem. And in the binding support in this manuscript is a fragment of the life of Saint Macrobius, a very old fragment and very rare. So this is a rare testimony to that story, Saint Macrobius, probably dating to about the 10th century. This is an important manuscript that we also own on site. This is the so-called the Kaczmarczyk Codex. And this contains the anaphoras of Basil, Gregory, and Cyril in Greek. So it actually looks like Coptic. The script is Coptic, but this shows the use of Greek to preserve the liturgy even into medieval times. So this is another example of the use of an older Coptic manuscript and a newer Arabic manuscript in this case. Here the binding fragment is from a Psalter, and the newer manuscript that it's being put in is a copy of the Pentateuch in Arabic. This is also a manuscript that we own on site. This is a Bible lectionary. There's an interesting story that goes along with this one. It was originally purchased from Christie's auction house, and Christie's advertised it as being much older because they misread the date. So it's 1572, but that's actually according to the Coptic year. So it was actually made in 1856. Maybe not as exciting, but still a very wonderful book and nicely decorated. Okay, so this is one we've digitized at the St. Macarius Monastery. This is a gospel book, and you can see the beautiful illumination again, much like the one at the Coptic Museum that I showed you a picture of earlier. This dates to the 14th century. Very nice manuscript, indicative of the medieval culture of the time, the book culture at Wadi Natrun. Here's another example, very similar to that last one. This one contains the Book of John. Also a copy of the Book of John. This one is from another of our collections that we digitized in Aleppo, showing how Coptic manuscripts sometimes migrate outside of Egypt and become incorporated into collections elsewhere in the Middle East. This is a very small book. This is small enough to carry in your pocket, 7 by 5 centimeters. Okay, a copy of the homily on St. George, showing St. George in miniature on the right. So this is a book written in Arabic. And Here we have a gospel book with the 4 evangelists shown on the right, dating to the 17th century. Sorry, 18th century, 1781. And this is to show that not all Coptic literature is necessarily biblical or religious. This is, well, religious for sure. In this case, the story of Barlaam and Yoasaph from an 18th century Arabic manuscript. This is actually a story that has traveled across cultures. So it goes back ultimately to a story of the Buddha, probably from India. But it becomes a saint's life in medieval times, and a Christian saint's life, that is, and showing kind of the flowering of Coptic literature in the medieval period and its preservation into the 18th century. So this is to kind of wrap up this presentation. If you want to find out more about the work that HMML does, and you want to access the resources, some of the things we've talked about, you can go to vhimmel.org/reading room, or just vhimmel.org, and then you can link to reading room from that page. You register, the registration is free, and then that enables you to access all of the images that we have on the website, and search, and you can find wonderful things, not only in Coptic, but in many other traditions as well. So thank you very much for joining this presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Dr. Calabro. This was fascinating, just like the other presentations in this series. I see that we already do have some questions, and we are ahead of our 11:30 end time, so we're just going to go right to them. Gary Markfort had a couple of questions. He wanted to know, is the Coptic alphabet the same as the Russian alphabet?
That's a good question. The answer is no, it's not the same. Russian uses the Cyrillic alphabet, which is named after Saint Cyril, and it is based on Greek in a way. So the Russian alphabet looks, the Cyrillic alphabet looks a lot like Greek, so it resembles Coptic for sure, but they are different alphabets. And Coptic uses the Greek. Exactly the Greek alphabet as it was current in at about 1st century CE, with about, depending on the dialect. In Bohairic, there are 7 additional letters that are added that are derived from Demotic Egyptian to represent sounds that did not exist in Greek.
Okay, thanks. His second question is, do the Coptic and Eastern Orthodox churches use different hierarchies or the same?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the Coptic Orthodox Church and which?
Do the Coptic and Eastern Orthodox churches use different hierarchy or the same?
Oh, I see. Okay, so by Eastern Orthodox, you probably mean the Greek Orthodox Church. So yeah, they're very similar. So in both cases, you have a prime. So you have in the Coptic Church, there's the Pope or Patriarch of the I'm speaking of the Coptic Orthodox Church, and then you have bishops underneath, and then priests and other clergy, and this is very similar to the Greek Orthodox Church. So yes, it's a very similar structure. Yeah, so the answer is yes to that for sure.
Okay. Next question from Arthur Grachik. You use the term magical text. What constitutes a magical text?
Oh, that's a great question. So this is actually an area that I do research on, and I'm glad you asked that, because I'm glad you didn't let me get away with this very casual use of the term magical. So it really depends on the context and who you're talking to. what constitutes a magical text? When I used the term earlier in this presentation to refer to the Old Coptic, the Great Magical Papyrus of Paris, what I had in mind is these are texts that that are aimed at the present life, right? These are texts that are aimed at solving problems that are encountered in life today. Like oftentimes these kinds of texts are aimed at helping someone fall in love with someone else, or the opposite is true. Like if your spouse is running off with somebody, then you have a spell to, or a charm to kind of stop that from happening. And things like if your cow or your sheep is sick, then there are charms for that. All kinds of things like this. There are charms against demonic forces. So this is kind of what I had in mind. Now I was using the term very loosely, and the problem comes up because you have the same kinds of texts that appear in very Christian contexts, where instead of invoking Isis and Horus, you might be invoking Saint George to make this desired effect come about. Or you might be invoking the Virgin Mary. Now, and of course, in those contexts, we wouldn't like to use the term magical, and the communities themselves would not use that term usually for the texts. And what ends up making the difference then is who you're talking to. And if for the way that these texts are viewed within the communities themselves, different terms would be used usually, like this is an exorcism, or this is a protective text to invoke heavenly powers to help in my life. But if I'm at and another term has come into popularity now, which I really like. It's the term ritual power. So this is a term that kind of says, it kind of describes what's being described without invoking the term magic, which so often magic is used to say, this is a way of saying that thing is other than what I do, right? That's how many people use the term magic. So ritual power is kind of better in that sense. But if I'm at a party talking with somebody and they're asking, well, what are you researching? If I say ritual power, or if I say these are texts to protect against demonic forces, a lot of that is going to go over people's heads. So oftentimes magic is a way of kind of describing that thing in a way that's understandable, widely understandable.
Thank you. Reminds me of invoking Saint Anthony for lost things.
Right.
Yes. Okay. So A Gold says, many thanks, great presentation. One question regarding Coptic text. Could you recommend a link for biblical text in Sahidic or Bohairic? I'm saying those right?
A source for biblical texts in Sahidic and Bohairic.
Yes.
Yeah. So probably the best critical edition, or the one that's still used today, that was printed actually long ago, is the edition of Horner. Horner's edition of this is for the New Testament in Bohairic and Sahidic. So he did two editions, one for Sahidic and one for Bohairic. Those are old enough that they're in the public domain, and you can find them on, like if you do a Google search, you can find them on archive.org. If you just type in Horner, Horner, and Sahidic Bible or Bohairic Bible, you can find those. For the other books of the Bible, you have to go to a number of different places. In general, though, like the one of Horner, these are older editions that you can access that are in public domain. So if you if you do a Google search, often that will lead you to the right places. And I do have a bibliography for that. So if you email me, my email address is dcalabro 001 at csbsju.edu. If you email me at that email address, I'll be glad to send you those resources.
Thanks. Gary said, thank you. Good answers to the previous questions. Janet is asking, what was going on with the Coptic Church at the time of Luther's Reformation?
That's a great question. So Reformation period. So you've got a lot of things going on there. So we're getting into the later Mamluk period and the Ottoman period by this time. And you have Arabic as the predominant language of theological expression. You have the use of Bohairic alongside Arabic for Bibles and such. There are enormous, very beautiful Bibles being produced during this period around Cairo. So also, so an interesting thing that you see, which we didn't really talk about very much in the presentation, is the interaction between Islamic and Coptic communities. So at this time in Egypt, I don't know that there was a lot of interaction going on with the Reformation in Egypt, but there was a lot of interfaith interactions going on between Muslims and Copts. And in a few examples, you have very interesting cases of Bibles that are being produced by scribes, both Muslim scribes and Christian scribes, working together, sometimes on the same book. They would produce it in blocks and then join the blocks later to make a full Bible. So this is one very small. I mean, I know I'm getting really detailed there, but this is a little window into a wide phenomenon of interaction between faiths. So there's a lot more to say about that, and there are resources for that. So again, if you email me, we can definitely talk more about that.
Yes, and I do see that Tim has popped your email into the chat. So folks, if you're looking for that, Anne Marie from the Morrison County Historical Society has also provided the addresses for each of the historical societies. And so you'll be able to go see the manuscripts. Tim says here, he gives a long chat here. The 9th century large Psalms fragment mentioned by Dr. Calabro may be seen at the Stearns History Museum. Go see the exhibits if you can. It is remarkable, 1,000+ year old manuscript. 2 of the other Coptic fragments in Dr. Calabro's presentation are on display at the Sherburne History Center. Benton County does not have any of the Coptic fragments, but Benton has 6 beautiful rare books and manuscripts on display as well. One is the Ancient Atlas showing much of North America as terra incognita, or land unknown. Oh, now I want to go see them. Let's see. I'm just going to see. Okay, and I think it's all just addresses so far. Amory says we will be sending a thank you message with the same contact information for all 5 organizations following the event, and thank you everyone. So we are right at 11:30 here, so we'll do our thank you and wrap up. I want to thank Dr. Calabro, the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, all of our partners, Mary Otsby today, our co-host from the Benton County Historical Society, but also the Sherburne, Stearns and Morrison County Historical Societies for this really, really great February event series. And I want to also thank our sponsor, the Central Minnesota Arts Board, through our Legacy Grant. And for our attendees, make sure if you can get to the exhibits to do so. But thank you so much for coming to our February event series. And quite a number of the folks here today have been at previous parts of this series. We will be emailing a survey to follow up. And I believe that ends our series. So thank you so much, Dr. Calabro. and the Hill
Thank you.
Museum and Manuscript Library.
Thank you so much.
All right. Have a great weekend, everyone.